I'm Sebastian. I'm a certified technical architect and the founder of Flow Republic, the elite Salesforce Academy. You might have heard about us. We've been coaching many CTAs successfully and help them pass their exam. We are trusted by individuals and offer academy programs for leading and established Salesforce partners such as Cognizant, Deloitte, IBM, PwC, Silverline, and many others. And this year has been really big for us. We just had 2 additional CTAs joining our team of coaches. And we're truly excited to announce many more offerings coming that will help you and other trailblazers to really unlock their true potential. Today, we are announcing our communication bootcamp that will really help you to boost your communication skills and blaze your trail to success.
Good morning to everybody that's on the call. Thank you very much for joining in. My name is Jonas Bott. So this is a session that I personally am quite passionate about because I think there's so much space in the architecture domain for design thinking. And I really want to talk about today about what it is, how we should embrace it as architects, and how we actually have some, what sort of mechanisms we can use to embrace it. So that's really the scope of today. I run a Salesforce and MuleSoft consulting firm called Jarvis. We're very new in the market, and it's a really exciting journey that we're on at the moment. And I'm also helping my friend Sebastian from Flow Republic to teach the next generation of CTAs. So let's get right into it. First of all, we're going to spend a bit of time on what is design thinking. Right after that, we're going to go on understanding what does that actually mean for architecture in general, and then what are the approaches. So what's design thinking? Design thinking is a human-centered approach to innovation, right? And the idea here is really that it draws from the designer's toolkit to integrate the needs of 3 areas: people, technology, and business. And just to visualize this, let's start with a little example. So think about a customer, right? That's a person, and that person has one goal. They want to buy a house. I think many of us have or will be in this situation at some point in their life. And when you start looking at buying a house, it's a daunting journey because you go like, oh, what are all the steps involved? And the first thing that comes to mind is I'm probably going to have to start saving. Once I've started saving, I start my mortgage application, I go to a bank. Now, the bank will then issue the loan approval and you go ahead and buy your house. By the way, if we have any finance experts in here, this is a very, very simplified version. So don't judge me on making this, oversimplifying this. However, from the bank's perspective, we really just cared about how much savings do you have and issuing the loan and can you repay it, right? And if I put myself into the bank's, the financial organization's shoes, there are a few things that I think about from a technology perspective. Right? The first thing that comes to mind, if I run a financial services organization, I gotta have to think about core banking. I need to solve for identity. So like, how do I identify my internal users, my external users? I certainly have concerns around CRM. How do I engage with my customers? What sort of forms can I issue? Like a lot of banks have PDF forms, and not all of them are digitized. So that's something that from a technology perspective, I certainly would look at. What mobile requirements do we have? Could be as simple as a banking application. Then what API strategy do we have? I need to worry about ATMs, around online banking, any support systems. So a lot of things that pop into my head from a technology view that I need to put in place. From a business perspective, I would think about, okay, what are the core business processes that I need to follow? There's certainly borrowing power. How much money can you borrow? How do we do the underwriting? What's our risk management strategy? How do I sell? So how do I win new customers? How do I market to those? How do I serve those once I have them on board? And what insights can I get out of this? Now, this is great, right? We've just looked at the financial services organization and understood that they have a technology and a business view, but we completely ignored the customer. Because as a customer, I have so much more to do than just save money, apply for a mortgage, get the loan and buy the house, right? For me, there is an element of financial planning involved. Not everybody is great in savings, so somebody might need help in understanding how can I achieve my saving goals. There are processes around document verification. I'm a perfect example. I was born in Germany. When I migrated to Australia, I had a ton of documents I needed to get verified. It's a tedious process if you don't know how it works. Then there is the property search and the details of those properties as a separate one. Once I get closer to the purchasing stage, I need to worry about conveyancing. I need to worry about legal advice. So all of those things are areas that I, as a customer, am concerned with. And now when we start really talking about design thinking, we really want to make sure that we take the people view into consideration and really start to understand how can we help our customers to not just get the loan approved in this scenario, but also help them with things like getting the right conveyancer, getting the right legal information, and so on and so forth. And if we break it down further, I think the key elements of design thinking are, first of all, people-centric, right? We worry about the people and the experience for those people, and then we figure out how we solve for that. The second bit is that it is hands-on, right? It's not just on a piece of paper where we have a bit of a brainstorm and think about strategies. No, it's about prototyping, right? It's highly creative. It's about understanding the customer and then coming up with a prototype in how we could solve that. And because it is a prototype, it means it's not perfect, but we go in an iterative way to improve it further, right? So always focusing on the people, we try to come up with a prototype that we then refine through iterations. And that really means that if we look at it, what do we bring together here, right? We're bringing together two elements. We're bringing together the analytical thinking and the intuitive thinking. As engineers or architects, right, and I certainly count myself to that category, I always think about how can I design solutions for reliability? How can I make them scalable? I want to look at what are proven solutions rather than going with an experimental design, because that might be a risk. Where from an intuitive perspective, as a designer, I would certainly think about what is the greatest experience for my customer here? Is it better if I have on the user interface a transition from the left to the right or the right to the left? Should I structure my components where the most important components on the top left part of the page or on the bottom right? So bringing those two worlds together really is what design thinking is all about. And let's talk about this a little bit more. So I've just spoken about the three areas that we want to bring together: business viability, technology feasibility, and the desirability that people bring forward. And if we look at those three core areas, we can actually learn quite a bit. So when we just look at the business and the technology, we're looking at process innovation, right? The business says, if a customer calls in within 15 minutes, we're going to have to respond to their inquiry. Maybe better if they email in. But we're really doing a process innovation where we're coming up with a new process if we look at technology and business. What happens if we look at people and technology? We're doing what is called a functional innovation. So here we're saying, okay, the people, so our customers, are able to complete their mortgage application online, right? Or it could be our internal people, right? Not when we're talking about design thinking, it's not always just about the customer. It could be your internal customer, which is your group of employees, right? Where we want to design functionality for them that makes their job easier, right? That could be a case automation process using Service Cloud. It could be optimizing the sales process using forecasting in Sales Cloud. So we're really trying to innovate on the functionality here that makes life for people easier. But what happens if we bring the business and the people together? I think what we're creating here is an emotional innovation. And what that really is, it's around the brand that you create, the way how you market to your customers, the way how you interact with your customers, the way how people feel about interacting with you as a business. And I think from a design thinking perspective, that's what we always need to worry about. And if we look at combining all those three areas, that's really when we're talking about the experience. And in this modern day and age, experience is one of the most important things for organizations, at least off the back of my experience. So how do we get to that stage? If the ideal outcome is to do an experience innovation, we certainly need to have a bit of a process around that. And I want to outline the very high level design thinking process. So how do we do that? First of all, we understand. And when I talk about understand, that could be in form of workshops with the customers. It could be in form of interviewing people. It could be in form of reviewing documentation that that organization has. Once we've got an overall understanding, we go into observation. And observation is one of the most important things where we do shadowing of employees, shadowing of customers. We call this ride-alongs. So essentially where we bring technology-skilled people into the business and really watch how they operate. It could be somebody monitoring how a customer service representative takes calls and responds to that calls. And it's not just the wording that they use, it's more about how do they pick up the phone? Does that give you a screen pop, for example, in Salesforce? Does it allow you to capture all the information that the customer has just given you over the phone? Or from a customer perspective, it could be following them how they try to find the contact us button on your customer community. If that's too hard, then customers get frustrated and the experience suffers. So once we've done this observation, we then really go into defining a point of view. And that point of view is really around, here are all the problems that we're having right now. And the big wins would be if we could automate X, Y, and Z. Now, once we've defined this, we can start to look at, okay, what's actually our solution here? So we can start looking at finding ideas, creating ideas around how can we solve what we've just defined in our point of view and what we've learned. And that could be as simple as researching specific products. You will certainly have seen this from other customers that they evaluate different tools, they talk to different people, and it's really finding the best fit for the organization. And once you've defined your ideas, and let's take for an example, we realize that we can automate a whole bunch of customer interactions using a chatbot, because it will take stress off the service center and it will customers a greater ability to self-serve, for example. The next thing is that we now want to develop a prototype. And obviously, the idea that we had, right, is to a certain extent in a hypothesis, where we say, if we put a bot in there, customers will be more happy and our service center will have less stress. That's our hypothesis. And that might be proven already through other customer success stories, etc. But for the organization, the context that we are working in right now, it's a hypothesis and we need to validate this. And that's why we're going ahead and we develop a prototype. And a prototype is really there to make sure that we can validate, is what we're doing here right now the right way moving forward. And that's what we do in the test, right? We have our prototype developed, we then test it, and then the most important thing happens. We take the learnings, right? Our prototype, it's not the goal to have a full-blown, ready-to-go solution that is perfect in all areas. It's about ensuring that our hypothesis is true. And we then take those learnings and we go into the second round. And we go through the same process again. Now, let's just break this down, right? We said the first three bits are really the problem definition, where the second, the three areas is all around the problem solution. And that's what we want to thrive towards too, right? One of the key things in design thinking is that pivoting is totally fine, right? We are building those prototypes to get learnings that allow us to pivot and to change our direction, because the experience is the desired outcome. And if the experience is not right after our first prototype, sure, we're going to refine it further to make sure we get it right. And that's really the idea of design thinking. Now, from an architecture perspective, I always get the shivers, right? When I hear like, oh, quick pivoting, and we're gonna have to be flexible and need to be able to change constantly. From an architecture perspective, that's scary, right? And let's just confirm that prototyping is really the fast validation and the ability to pivot to specific problems, right? So we really want to be fast and flexible, and we think about the short term, validate our hypothesis. And think of a Salesforce scenario, right? How quickly can we make this happening in Salesforce? Create a custom object, modify the data model, we can add some process automation on top of it. It's really quick to build a prototype or to spin up a community, right? We can probably build a community to validate if a customer would use it within a couple of days. That's probably not fully branded and so on and so forth, but we certainly have the ability. Now, as an architect, as I mentioned, I get scared when I hear rapid prototyping and many pivots, etc., because as an architect, I always consider the wider impact of specific solutions on the business, but also the data, the application, the information that it goes with, right? And that's complex because it doesn't just consider Salesforce in my scenario, it considers the wider enterprise architecture. And because I always worry about the long term, I think it's certainly a challenge to bring this together. A good example is, let's say, going back to our banking scenario that I've kicked off with. Let's say we've decided we're going to implement Financial Services Cloud. We can, again, install the package really quick, right? And do some basic configurations to get a prototype up and running really fast, right? That's the benefit of an industry solution. Now, as an architect, I'm concerned, okay, great that we have this fantastic customer data model in Financial Services Cloud. But if I look at the wider enterprise, how does it actually integrate? Is that in line with our master data management solution? What integrations do I need to build to make this happening? What's the complexity that comes with that? And that's certainly something that will hinder us from doing those quick prototypes once we validate them to get them into production. And where I'm getting to is that I think from a traditional architecture lens, we always sort of like thought about ITs in the center, and then there's the business around it that thinks about process automation. Then we have our marketing teams that essentially do the engagement with the customer. And then there's our customer that interacts with us. And as an architect, I always thought about, okay, that's an inside out view. I get a strategy from a business, maybe from the marketing team, and I solve the IT problems based on the strategy that the business has given out, right? So like I'm essentially trying to reinvent business processes to realize the outside expectations. And the outside expectations in this scenario are a hypothesis. So I'm comfortable with this, right? Because I get business requirements and I can see, cool, how can I fit this into my wider enterprise architecture? But what would happen if we shift this around? What happens if we say, hey, as an architect, let's not just have this inside out view. Let's go and have an outside in view, where essentially we first look at what is the customer after, right? What is the experience that they are seeking? What's the brand experience? What's the perception? What's the consistent way to interact with my organization? And then I take those experiences or those point of views from our customers and start then to architect for that from an inside out approach. And that can work really well, because all I have now is that I've essentially shifted my business requirements from coming from the business to coming from the customer. That being said, I obviously would never define my the business requirements from a customer alone, right? What I really suggest here is that architects should be part of the customer journey mapping activities. They should work closely with the marketing teams to understand what is the experience that you're trying to create and what are our customers saying, to then get those learnings early, bring them in internally, and then having the ability to design your enterprise architecture for that. So what does that mean? Or how do we bring this together? Let's say, as an architect, first of all, why should I care, right? Because as an architect, I just want to solve problems that are technical. But I think that's not quite true, because I think architects play an absolutely important role when it comes to defining the strategy in how your business moves forward. Because quite quickly, an architect can say, hey, this is going to be really complicated to achieve versus this is a really quick win, right? And if you think about it from a business perspective, if you only care about the experience that you want to provide to the customer, and you don't get a reality check from an architect saying, this is going to be really challenging to achieve in the time that you have available, then the earlier you can provide that feedback, the greater the chance of pivoting early, right? The second thing is, because as architects, we're always building applications that ultimately serve either an internal or external stakeholders. And we by nature understand that point of view, right? We want to have more automation. We want to have less clicks. We want a seamless experience. All those kind of things are areas that we hear all the time. But I think what we're really good at is connecting the dots, because a customer might say, I want to have a seamless online portal. The marketing team might say, I want to make sure I can see every interaction with that customer in one central view. For me as an architect, that means, okay, cool, I probably need to build a customer community, store that in Salesforce as a contact and account, and then connect, I don't know, some marketing automation software to sync that information back in. So we're naturally good at connecting those dots. However, traditionally, we just solved those problems set out by the internal stakeholders. So if we're now switching this around and we say, cool, let's use the outside in view and allow architects to capture the needs, problems, and aspirations of all people, it makes it so much easier for architects to allow for innovations to be solved using our traditional lens that we're comfortable with, right? So all I'm really saying is make sure architects get access to your customers' requirements. But Mel, there's still the one problem that I haven't addressed, right? And the one problem I haven't addressed is a pretty fundamental one. How do I design a scalable architecture that allows for rapid prototyping and pivoting? And that's a really hard thing to do. And I think I have five approaches that I think are important, right? The first one is around not mixing up POC and prototypes. So really have a clear understanding on that. We want to make sure we understand the enterprise architecture holistically. We certainly want to talk about frameworks. We want to be able to assess the impact of solutions that we're building, and we need to identify how to scale. So let's break this down a bit more, right? From an architect's view, a proof of concept is really has the goal of testing the viability of progressing, right? Is this possible? That's the key question that I ask myself when I build a proof of concept. And the way how I would do this is the fastest way I can achieve this. I create an API mocking interface instead of fully implementing the API, because all I need to make sure is that I can handle a specific response in a specific format, for example. I would surface Lightning Web Components with dummy data. If I just want to get a validation that I can do something, I don't need to fully integrate it. If I just, for example, want to validate that I can build a Lightning Web Component that can show me 3 different images, right? I would just hard code the images in there just to validate that I can do that. Again, hard coded logic just to validate if it's possible. The idea here really is focus on validating the assumption to decide how to proceed, right? If I cannot achieve this at a technology level, I'm not gonna, no point in moving ahead. So how is that different to a prototype? Well, a prototype is a working version. So a prototype, the idea here is that the prototype should be a working version of what you want to achieve, because you need it in order to give it to your customers to really validate it, right? And by all means, this is not an MVP. It's not perfect. It will have flaws in it, but it gives you an idea on how it will work together and hang together. It could be a customer community that allows you to capture the banking mortgage application form, for example, right? If that's what you want to validate as part of your POC, if you want to validate that customers would use this, then I would build a prototype that does exactly that. It might not have all the right business logic underneath. It might not have the final design against it, but it is working. And I think that's not really coming to the architect bit. As an architect, because we're building prototypes, separate out your business process automation and any logic that you're building from existing logic. So if you're working in a big org and you have, I don't know, already many different process builders and many different Apex classes, etc., for a prototype, my recommendation would be build this completely in isolation. Because if we look back at the very first slide, when we spoke about what's the standard design thinking process, there is a learning, and then we go into the next iteration to pivot, to change the prototype, to improve it. If I extend my existing business logic, that's just always really hard, right? It's a lot harder to go through a process builder that has 20 different scenarios in it than just one process builder that is pretty straightforward, where I just need to go in and maybe change a filter, right? Or an Apex class, where it's a lot easier to write a simple Apex class that I can easily maintain than one big Apex class that might even have dependencies on other stuff and other teams, etc. So my recommendation is really separate out your business logic as you're prototyping. Once you go ahead for an MVP, then bring it together to avoid technical debt. Obviously, keep your integrations as lean and linear as possible, right? If you can in a prototype, avoid it, but I understand that you can't do that all the time, right? So make sure you're not over-engineering the integration in a prototype. Maybe if you're building a prototype and you have the option of going point-to-point versus an ESB in a prototype, point-to-point integration might be just the faster way that gets you there, right? And don't forget, the ultimate goal here is that we want to get something to work as quick as possible to get feedback, right? So it's not about a beautiful design under the hood. It's really about validating it's about validating your assumption and to make sure that this is a way moving forward. If it's a way moving forward, then you do this properly and convert it into a working product. Second area, understand the entire architecture. So obviously there are two lenses to that. The first one is the enterprise-wide lens. For me, key questions here are, what's a master data management strategy? Because if you're suddenly introducing Salesforce to, for example, be the customer master, that certainly will have some fundamental implications. So depending on where you are in your design thinking process, this might cause a much wider conversation. So again, my suggestion would be, if you're just prototyping, build it in isolation. And then at the same time, as an architect, you need to start thinking, okay, we're building this in isolation right now, but how would that work, right? And do an impact assessment, which I will talk about in a second. I would want to know what's the integration strategy. So again, in enterprises, we know there are many different systems. So it's important that we understand how is that all stitched together. Is there like some central orchestration layer? Is that all point-to-point? Is it all event-driven? What's the tool set in itself? So those questions are important. Also, for me, it's important to understand what system is responsible for what, right? There might be a underwriting system in our banking scenario. There might be a marketing automation software already. So where does that prototype actually fit in? Is it a new system? Is it replacing something? Is that augmenting an already existing process? So really understanding those aspects. And understand how identities are managed. So in enterprise scenarios, I always find that identity management is a very strong priority for obvious reasons. So it's important to understand that, so you make sure that your product fits into that. Right? You don't want to suddenly create customer community users with Salesforce identities if the enterprise strategy is to use ping for that. So what does it mean from a Salesforce perspective? In Salesforce, we obviously want to, if I narrow it down, right, we move from the enterprise perspective to the Salesforce view, then I really want to understand what objects are responsible for what function, right? Where do we store the, I don't know, financial viability of a customer? Is that stored in Salesforce? Is that in a custom object? Is that on the account? Is that on the contact? I want to understand what are the standards that we're trying to adhere to? Because again, when I'm building prototypes, I want to make sure they fit within the standards that we're having, and don't go out of that, because we always want to strive for consistency and maintainability and so on and so forth. Sharing, super important for obvious reasons, right? Like if you have a wrong configuration on that, it's going to have quite a big impact. What's your data classification? Do you have PII data? Do you have GDPR compliance requirements? Do you have HIPAA compliance requirements, PCI, and all that kind of stuff? And then last question would be, how does the solution scale in terms of data? And again, going back to, yes, we're building rapid prototypes, but if we know that this rapid prototype will generate 60 million rows of data every year, I certainly, as an architect, need to start thinking about how do I archive this information, because it's too much to store in Salesforce. And then my favorite topic, frameworks, right? So in order to support rapid prototyping, that doesn't mean that we need to neglect good architecture. We can literally start to just think about layering our architecture, building a reusable set of Lightning Web Components, building a reusable set of Apex classes, building a reusable pattern for process builders, right? So we can certainly start thinking about mechanisms to layer our architecture to make sure it's scalable and adaptable. And I think one of the things that we always can thrive for is to solve common problems or recurring problems with a framework or a pattern. Think about things like you're building a prototype and your prototype needs to make calls to 3 external systems. Now we have the option of either hard coding 3 Apex classes that all make that call, or to say, okay, look, in this scenario, we know that there's more than one integration. Let's just build a call out framework, something that allows us to call external systems in a consistent fashion. It could be, how do we handle errors that get thrown as part of our logic, right? If an error occurs, can we have a common pattern in how we handle error logging that we can adopt even for prototypes? It could be things like trigger handling, etc. Right? And then I think when we're building those frameworks, and I appreciate this is quite technical, but think about things like dependency injection, composition versus inheritance. How do you do logging, call out, trigger handling? How do you structure your process builders, right? And make sure this is designed in a flexible way. Don't lock yourself into one way, and if you need to pivot, you can't get out of it. That's the worst thing to do, right? Because that means we've built a static construct that's also hard to maintain in the long run. Again, I mentioned it before, if you're prototyping, I would extend, instead of extending existing complexity, I would certainly keep it separate and build my prototype, get validation, and then once we're clear on the direction, merge it into the existing functionality. It's just faster. That's why I would go with that approach. And then lastly, please document how to use the standards that you've established, right? If you've built a fantastic framework that's super scalable and can be extended easily or reused easily for all of those different prototypes you're doing, please document how to use them, because otherwise nobody will use them, and that's going to be a real problem. Obviously, one of the key things when we're doing this rapid prototyping is assessing the impact. And I really assess the impact from a few different areas, right? First of all, what resources do I need to accomplish what I need to accomplish? And do I have those resources? So what I mean by that is, it might not just be a Salesforce consultant or developer or admin to configure a bunch of stuff in Salesforce. It might be an external system that we're integrating. Imagine we want to integrate with a conveyancing cost estimator tool, right? We certainly need to have somebody from that tool to help us with that, if that's something that we want to offer to our customers as part of the banking application process. Then you need to understand, is that going to impact my core architecture domains? Do I need suddenly middleware? Do I change the source of truth from one system to another? That's a big impact one, right? Is a prototype a quick win for all parties? So like, does only the customer benefit, or does on top of the customer also the business benefit and the IT department benefit, right? Because you might have that. Assess the impact and understand how can you reduce that complexity, understand the testing and deployment efforts. Oops. And then I normally put this onto this matrix, right? So like if the business value is high and the complexity is low, it's a no-brainer, right? Go for it, that's an easy win. But if the complexity is high and the business value is high, then certainly that's a strategic initiative, but I would split it out to create smaller prototypes to get that feedback faster. Right? Last slide. How do you scale? So obviously, as I said, break down complex applications into smaller ones, right? We really want to try to avoid building these big monolithic applications and rather break them down into smaller ones because they're easier to maintain and we're faster to pivot on those. Now, everybody always says clicks over code. And I actually disagree with that statement. I think it is clicks and code. And the reason why I believe that is because sometimes you gotta have to extend the Salesforce functionality and you do need code to do that, right? So it's just the right decision of when to use clicks versus when to use code. For example, if you do a bulk insert of 50,000 records every night into Salesforce, probably not the best idea to have a process builder on that object, right? Because you might run into scalability issues. Refactor as you go. So once you've done your prototypes and now you want to move and you're happy that your prototype is good to go, now you want to move it to the next stage to an MVP, really start to refactor that prototype that you've built where you separated out your logic into your overall patterns that you've already established in your org. Because if you keep it separate, that's when you create technical debt. Hence the suggestion here, make sure to refactor as you go. And then listen to feedback, right? And that feedback can come from the business, it can come from customers, and really identify what does that feedback mean? And is there something off the back of that feedback that allows me to create another pattern? And then lastly, stick to the rules, right? So obviously there are patterns for enterprise architecture, they're documented and there are books written about it, etc. So I certainly suggest making sure to stick to the basic rules and making sure you apply them in the right way. It could be things like the different patterns of callouts. It could be how do you build independent components, composition versus inheritance, things like that I've mentioned earlier. So all of that is really what I wanted to talk about today. I know I'm almost out of time and I want to allow for a little bit of questions. So we'll stop here and say thank you very much for joining in and happy to answer some questions now. I'm just going through the question log here. Somebody's asking, as an architect, do you use business analysts? Do they help with gathering marketing user needs? Yes, absolutely, right? Like business analysts are incredibly important in a big project to make sure that you get that low level information that you want. Let me just find another question. Are frameworks comparable to design patterns? Yes. I think when I talk about design patterns, a design pattern could be in software engineering, could be something like inheritance, polymorphism, etc. A framework for me is more the use of those design patterns. So that could be your callout framework that is taking advantage of the design pattern of dependency injection, for example. Any recommendations for documenting frameworks? Yes, I think there are two layers to it. Technical documentation, so what's under the hood and how to use it, and business documentation. Why should you use that? What are the benefits of using that framework? So yeah, break it out into two different areas. Great question here. What does MVP mean in this situation? So I spoke about POC and prototype, and I appreciate I didn't speak about MVP. The prototype sits in between of the MVP and the POC. So an MVP is actually a working version of what you want to go live with. And the idea is that the MVP, yes, it is minimal viable product, but it is a viable product. Where a prototype might look not exactly the way how you want your MVP to look like, right? It's a stage before that. It will not have all the functionality that your MVP might have. Hence, I would certainly suggest to separate those two. Where else do I have? A lot of people say thanks, so thank you very much for the feedback. Here's another question. Are these more technical architects or also for application architects? 100% both, right? A technical architect, obviously you probably from my presentation could hear that I'm coming more from a technical background and hence I'm talking about a lot of technical areas. But even from an application architect perspective, I totally expect you to be involved in that. And a good example is as an application architect, especially in the Salesforce world, you're concerned with data modeling, you're concerned with sharing, two of the core domains in Salesforce that require assessment, right? If remember when I spoke about master data management and where does data live in Salesforce, application architects should absolutely be involved in that. How do you learn design patterns? Do you have any good resources? There are numerous books. There are even books written for the Salesforce specific domain, and I would certainly encourage looking at those. Trade-offs between diagrams, lucid chart in brackets, and prototype in Salesforce. So I guess the question here is like, what's the benefit between just putting it on a piece of paper versus building it out? A lot of people, and especially customers and business users, in my experience, learn and are able to provide feedback much faster when they are seeing something in front of them that they can play with. Just looking at a piece of paper is a lot harder. So think about a data model will not mean very much to the business. However, seeing the data model in action and how it behaves and how records relate to each other and how updates across records can happen, that's when the business is normally able to give you a lot of feedback and validation. Hence, I would reserve diagrams for my technical audience if I want to document something, and a prototype really to get feedback, right? And a big part of design thinking is to get that feedback based on the ability to play with stuff. There is a question, who is the person to responsible or review the architect provided solution to implement by the developer? So if I understand the question correctly, the question here is, who is responsible to define the solution, to validate the solution that is going to be implemented by the developer and the admin? Well, we're now talking about project governance, right? In a project governance scenario, I would certainly look at an architecture review board to look at sort of like those core architectural decisions. That being said, though, I would expect that to happen later in the process. For prototype, to be really honest, I would expect to go fast, right? And a prototype, to me, we're talking about days, right, to get a prototype up and running. We're not talking about building a prototype for 10 weeks to then get feedback. That time frame is way too long, right? We want to make sure we get feedback really fast. So I think once you move beyond the prototyping stage and you go into, okay, now we want to build it, that's when you need to have architecture review boards, etc., in place to make sure that it is in line with the wider architecture. There is a whole bunch of questions around, can you send us some details to resources and links? More than happy to share them afterwards. I might just post them on my LinkedIn, unless there's a better place to post this. Varuna, do you have an answer on that?
No, it could be LinkedIn or through Twitter, one of the two.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, I'll make sure I'll post something in the next few days. Okay. Can you suggest some books? Yep, I'll post that as well. I'm out of time. Thank you for the feedback. I hope this was valuable for you.
We were just a bunch of nerdy kids who ignored the haters. We took their ridicule and we built on it. And when some of us gave up, well, we built on that too. Built resilience, built on a mission to make things a little better every day until the users came. Then the haters were VCs who scoffed at our audacity. This just isn't the way things are done. But we kept building. Users turned into teams, turned into companies, running their entire businesses on our apps. Then the software giants came after us. We weren't proven, we weren't fully featured, our radical cloud model wasn't secure. But we built on. And today, as companies adopt the cloud to move faster, teams are finding themselves slowed down by each other's efforts. The skeptics are claiming we'll never develop innovation at scale. But now, DevOps have come to the cloud, ushering in a new era of transformation. Companies can release on demand across hundreds of environments, innovating faster with fewer conflicts and fewer disruptions. There will always be challenges. There will always be naysayers. And we'll build on.